Well, we live in a bad news world right now, and more bad news. We're beginning it in 2021 with under lockdown. Things are far from normal, are they? Or back to normal. We're not getting back to normal anytime soon. And yeah, but there's hope. Vaccinations are coming and whatnot. We'll get through this. But yeah, right now, certainly not back to normal. And going to church is not back to normal. How we express our faith, we've experienced this huge disruption in it. And I know that some of you love it when I do the church films, these online worship expressions, when I do them actually from the sanctuary, because then you get to see your church home. You get to see it and it feels more normal. And in fact, I think back to March when there was the first lockdown last March, and we pastors were scrambling, trying to figure out what we were doing. And I know that some of my colleagues tried so hard to make it feel like things were normal. And so they'd set up the cameras and whatnot in the sanctuaries and to make it appear as if nothing was different. Of course, that to me just felt more abnormal than anything. So I went with this kind of thing, and well, I don't know if that's the right thing to do or not. Who knows? As I've often said to many people, they don't teach you this stuff in seminary. But the point is, nothing is normal, is it? And for so many of us, we're feeling a disconnection from how we normally express our Christian faith. We're used to church being a part of it, and going to church, and in the physical building there, and being amongst the people and with the people and being able to hug them. And none of that is, of course, happening right now. And so it's been a huge disruption for us. Well, you know, there was a huge disruption back in the early days of Christianity, back amongst the early Christians, when things had changed. And, you know, we have some hope of things getting sort of back to normal, but they knew that there would be no going back to normal. So as we look at their disruption back then, that's going to help us with our disruption today. So what was their disruption back then? Okay, well, imagine that you're a good Jewish person. You're used to the temple being a big part of the expression of your faith. You go there at appointed festivals and times. You make pilgrimages there. You do sacrifices there. All this kind of thing. It's a big part of the expression of your faith. And then you hear about Jesus. You hear about his death, but you also hear about his resurrection. And then you start looking into it, and you come to recognize that, boy, all these Old Testament scriptures are actually pointing to Jesus, that he is the fulfillment of all the promises that God said he would do. So you place your trust in Jesus. But what do? You keep going to the temple. It continues to be a part of the expression of your faith. Yeah, you might be a Christian now, but you're a Jewish Christian. You're still Jewish. So you're still making the temple a focus of your faith and the expression of your faith. And actually we see the disciples doing that. Read through the book of Acts. You can hear some dogs there. You read through the book of Acts and you'll discover there that there are the disciples at the temple doing the things they would normally do at the temple. However, here's the disruption. In AD 67, so not too long after the time of Jesus' death and resurrection in 30-something, but in AD 67 there's a rebellion on the part of the Jewish people against the Romans who were in charge at that time. And by 70, the Romans got fed up and they basically besieged the city, surrounded it. No food could get in or out. And of course, things ground to a halt. Things went terribly badly, and they suffered under the siege for many months, actually. And finally the city fell, and the temple was absolutely destroyed, not being rebuilt again. And of course, to this day, it still hasn't been rebuilt. So that is a huge disruption for those people who in those days the temple would have been such a central part of their expression of faith. And all of a sudden, it's gone. So what are we to do then as Jewish Christians? How do we continue expressing our faith with this huge disruption? Well, John chapter 1 is going to help us, and there's one verse in particular that really helps us to think through this. You can probably guess what it is, right? But let me read it to you from John 1:14. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Now, what does that have to do with the temple in Jerusalem? Well, let's look at it again. The Word became flesh and lived among us. And let's remember that the Word there, John chapter 1, as it begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning. And really, in the early part of John 1, there is speaking to us about, here is God coming to us in the flesh. And so verse 14 is kind of summarizing this, and the Word became flesh and lived among us, or some translations put it, he dwelt among us. And what's important here is that the word there for dwelling among us, it's actually the word for pitching a tent, as if he pitched his tent among us. I think one translation even puts it that way. Another way to put it is he tabernacled among us. Now that's ringing a bell in some minds. A tabernacle, where have we heard of that before? Well, in the days of Exodus, back when you look back in Exodus, from when God rescued his people out of Egypt, and there they are in the wilderness, awaiting the time that they could go into the promised land. And God's like, look, I am your God, you are my people. I call you my son. We're in this relationship, we're in this covenant relationship. And I want to live among you, and I'm really going to symbolize that through, you're going to build me a tent. It's known as the tabernacle, and it literally was a tent. A fancy one, but a tent. And so they're all living in tents at this point, of course. So there's this tabernacle. And that is the place where God was said to reside amongst his people. In other words, here I am living with you, among you. And so here's God with his people. And later on, when they get established in the promised land and they're kings and Jerusalem, well, finally they instead of a tent for God, they actually build him a proper house. That's the temple. And so there's the tabernacle, and then comes the temple. So here's, in verse 14 then, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. Of course, back in the early days of Christianity, anybody hearing that would have said, ding, 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 we don't go to the temple to find where God resides. We go to Jesus. That is where we find God living, in Jesus. We look to him, not to the temple now. So how do we handle this disruption of the temple being destroyed? Well, actually, we shouldn't be so focused on the temple anymore anyway. We should be focused on Jesus. That's where God tabernacles among us now. And so let's read on in the verse. It bears it out even more. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. He lived among us, and we have seen his glory. Another ding, ding, ding. We have seen his glory. That's, if you wanted to see God's glory, you'd go to the temple. If you wanted to know where God's glory settled, it was at the temple. And when we think about God's glory there, you can look to the Old Testament passages that speak of his, now I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but some people say it's Shekinah and others say Shekinah. I don't know. But anyway, God's Shekinah glory was said to rest upon the temple. That's where God was said his glory to reside. But here is Jesus now. God, the Word became flesh, tabernacled among us, and we have seen his glory. We don't go to the temple if we want to see God's glory. We see it actually in Jesus. That's where God's glory is found now. And the glory as of a father's only son. And think back to the temple, and only one person could ever go into the most holy place where God's glory was. And that was the high priest, only once a year. And after a huge amount of religious rigmarole, because holy God, unholy people doesn't make a good mix. So there's lots of religious rigmarole to consecrate, to become holy enough to be able to be even approach God's glory. But here's Jesus, unique, and that's what the word has behind the force here, the glory of God's Father's only Son. Something unique about Jesus that you won't find in any of the priests down at the temple. There's something unique about Jesus. He is the one he has resided in the Father's glory. That's where we see it. He is full intimacy with God, full friendship with God, whereas the priests down at the temple, they can't have that. And neither can we, because God is holy and we are not. That's under the old covenant system. But now, under the new covenant, there is God's glory on Jesus. And he is so intimate with the Father in a way that no one ever had been that the priesthood couldn't be. So the Father's only Son, full of grace. And if you wanted to know about grace, you'd go down to the temple. And of course, you would take part in the sacrifices, which pointed to the forgiveness of sin. You can think of the Day of Atonement, for example, and atoning for people's sins. But here's Jesus full of grace. Now, if you want to know about grace, you don't go to the temple. Now you go to Jesus, because it's in Jesus that we find grace. It's in He is the ultimate sacrifice for sin. And so grace is found in Him. He's full of grace and truth. Again, if you want to know what's true, what's real, you go to the temple to recognize the reality of God and the reality of our relationship with God. But not anymore. Now you find it in Jesus. You discover the reality of God and what's true about our relationship with God. So here's John chapter 1, verse 14, really hammering out this point here of it's not at the temple. Don't worry about the destruction of the temple, because it's in Jesus that we find God's presence focused. It's in Jesus that we now approach God. You know, this is really borne out in the book of Hebrews. If we were to read through the book of Hebrews, we'd see through there this idea of, you know, back in the old days we had the temple and whatnot and the religious priesthood and whatnot, but now we have Jesus. And just even reading through some of the chapters there, you'll see Jesus is compared to the angels. The angels just don't compare. He's compared to Moses. Moses just doesn't compare. Jesus is compared to the priesthood. The priests just don't compare. Melchizedek, a different kind of priest, he even doesn't compare. And the covenant, the old covenant, just doesn't compare, although it's very important, but it just doesn't compare. And of course the temple, when you get into Hebrews chapter 9, the temple and all the system of sacrifice and everything, it just doesn't compare. And so the book of Hebrews is also this idea of the temple's destroyed. Don't worry about it, because that's not actually the most important thing right now. And you know, this disruption that came to the people back then through the destruction of the temple, this disruption, it actually was a good thing in some ways, in that it taught them some lessons. You see, worship at the temple could become worship of the temple. And when we want to keep that in mind as we're thinking of worship at church, and the fact that we can't worship at church right now, is it possible that worship at church can become worship of church? Good question. And the Bible picks up on this idea of worshiping the temple, or being impressed by it anyway, in Mark chapter 13 and other places, but let me look at Mark 13. And here Jesus and the disciples, they're approaching Jerusalem, and or they're in Jerusalem rather. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." In other words, wow, this place is impressive. And it would have been impressive. It would have been absolutely beautiful. It would have been impressive that the thing was built. It would be just an amazing wonder to behold, to see the temple in Jerusalem back in that day before it was destroyed, obviously. But here's the disciples impressed by it. And notice what Jesus says. Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings?" You know, Jesus is saying, yeah, these buildings are great. Do you see these? And not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. Ouch. In other words, are you impressed by this temple? Don't be, because it's only temporary. It won't be here much longer. In fact, he goes on to warn them in verses 14 and following, when you see certain signs, make sure you get out of Jerusalem. Because it would have been a temptation for the Jewish Christians who cherished the traditions around the temple and being in the temple, and who would have cherished it. There would have been the temptation to stay in Jerusalem during the siege of the Romans and to try and protect it. And Jesus is saying to them, don't do that. That's not your focus anymore. Your focus is going to be on me. See what that disruption did, the destruction of the temple? It helped all those Jewish Christians be able to refocus, to focus now on Jesus, as this is where we discover the full glory of God is in Jesus. This is where, if we're seeking God, this is where we go to, is we go to Jesus. If we want to be in his presence, we go to Jesus. And that we want to boldly approach the throne of grace, we go to Jesus, not to the temple. You see, worship at the temple could become worship of the temple. So is it possible that just as worship at the temple can become worship of the temple, that worship at churches can become worship of churches? Is it possible that that happens? I think it is, sadly, and maybe we're being taught in this time that we don't want to be about what's impressive. You know, we don't want people to walk away from church thinking how impressive what we do for God. But rather, we want people to recognize the impressive thing that God is doing through people to make an impression on the world, to make a difference in the world. And maybe that's the lesson we're to bring from this, is to focus less on being impressive and to focus more on leaving an impression. Not so much building impressive churches, but building into people so that they can make an impression on others. And, you know, nobody's being impressed by big churches right now. You know, churches that house thousands of people. They're only allowed 10 at the moment in Ontario. Nobody's being impressed by these big buildings right now. But it does make an impression, a lasting impression, when somebody experiences forgiveness from another person, especially when they don't deserve it. It does leave an lasting impression on somebody when they experience generosity from someone. It does leave a lasting impression on people when they experience faithfulness from someone. And, you know, we can think of the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, self-control, and these kinds of things. And we can recognize what an impression that God, as he creates that fruit in us, how that changes people's lives around us. What an impression it leaves. So maybe we're being weaned at this moment from building things that are impressive, building ministries that are impressive, churches that are impressive. And maybe God's speaking to us about becoming a people through whom God makes an impression on others, through whom God can change the world, quite literally. And, you know, I'd thought about including this little bit about Trump earlier, but then I decided to cut it. But because of recent events, I decided to stick it back in. And, you know, I heard back when he was elected this idea of, well, maybe he's not a man of God, but maybe he's God's man for the moment. And I remember thinking to myself, let's just focus on us being men and women of God. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we had men and women of God and throughout this hemisphere, throughout this world? Think of many trouble spots around the world where there's just such angst and polarization and difficulty. What a difference it would be if there were men and women of God, if there were people who were showing the fruit of the Spirit in their lives. That would change the world. And what have we Christians been doing? Well, maybe we've been caught kind of trying to build impressive ministries, impressive churches, instead of building into people that we can make an impression on the world, that God can make an impression on the world through us. So maybe now's a time for repentance. You know, there's bad news. The bad news is that there's a huge disruption to the way we express our faith. We can't just go to church at the moment. But there's good news. The good news is being with Jesus is far more important than being in a church building. Now, don't get me wrong, when we do get back to opening up the church building and whatnot, I do hope that as you feel comfortable and as vaccinations get rolled out, that hope to see you there. But it's not about being there. Being there is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. The end in itself, of course, is being with God, being with Jesus. And I hope that as Calvary Baptists, we're going to continue with what our aim is to the glory of God, helping people walk with Jesus in faith, hope, and love. Again, it shouldn't be about us and about our ministry, our church, but rather it's about Jesus and helping people to walk with him, to pointing people to Jesus, about helping them to walk with him and learn from him and grow in him. That's the end. And what we do as a church, it's just a means to an end. So the fact that there's a huge disruption right now, it's okay, we'll get through this. But also, let's hit the reset button. Yeah, let's get back to helping people walk with Jesus. Not helping people get settled into a church building and feel comfortable and enjoy, be impressed by the ministry. That's not it. Let's help people walk with Jesus. And you know what? We don't need a building to do that. But let's do it. Bad news is our expression of our faith is very unusual right now. We can't go to church. The good news is the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Being in the presence of God is what it's all about. And you know, we might ask the question, when are we getting back to normal? Oh, actually, being with Jesus is far more exciting than getting back to normal anyway. So let's concentrate on that.